December 16th, 1944, Bastogne, Belgium, 0430 hours, -12 Celsius, dense fog cutting visibility to 40 meters. Captain James Polk pressed his back against frozen brick and counted 67 rounds remaining in the company's collective ammunition pool for 12 M1 Garrins, fewer than 6 per rifle. The German encirclement had choked supply lines for 72 hours. Resupply aircraft couldn't penetrate the weather, and ground convoys were 12 kilometers out with panzer units blocking every road. His radioman tapped Morse on a failing battery. Nuts. McAuliffe's famous reply to surrender demands, but Polk knew defiance didn't feed magazines. By 0600, forward observers reported engine noise from 3 directions. The 101st Airborne had held this crossroads town for 3 days on guts and dwindling material. Now engineers were pulling nails from crates to fashion makeshift barricades, and medics were reusing bandages after boiling them in helmet water. One staff sergeant had begun cataloguing the belt buckles and canteen cups of the dead, sorting them by metal type for potential shrapnel if it came to that. Polk checked his watch. In 6 hours, either the sky would clear or the ammunition would run dry. Either outcome would decide 23,000 lives. The situation in Bastogne had deteriorated from dire to absolutely catastrophic in 72 hours. On December 13th, the 101st Airborne Division and attached armor units had rushed into the town as German forces poured through the Ardennes in what would later be called the Battle of the Bulge. The orders were simple: hold the crossroads. 7 major roads converged on Bastogne, making it the logistical heart of the southern Ardennes. Whoever controlled those roads controlled the flow of men and material across 80 kilometers of front. The German 5th Panzer Army needed Bastogne to sustain its westward push toward the Meuse River and ultimately Antwerp. The Allies needed it to prevent that push from succeeding. But holding a town required ammunition, and ammunition required supply lines, and supply lines required either clear skies for air delivery or open roads for truck convoys. By December 16th, the 101st had neither. Polk moved through the cellar of what had been a bakery before the German shelling started. 16 soldiers occupied the space, their breath visible in the frigid air. Most wore standard olive drab wool uniforms with field jackets, inadequate for the coldest December Belgium had seen in several decades. Frostbite cases were multiplying faster than the battalion medics could treat them. 23 men in Polk's battalion alone had lost fingers or toes to cold injury in the past 48 hours. One private sat in the corner wrapping burlap around his frozen boots, the leather having cracked through after 3 days of snow and mud. Another soldier cleaned his rifle with a scrap of undershirt because the company had exhausted its supply of bore cleaner on day 2. Equipment degradation was becoming as serious a threat as enemy fire. The ammunition problem wasn't just about quantity alone, it was about distribution, variety, and the brutal mathematics of sustained combat. The 101st had jumped into Normandy on June 6 with full combat loads, 80 rounds per rifleman, belts of .30 caliber for machine guns, fragmentation grenades, mortar shells. They'd been resupplied continuously through the summer and fall campaigns, but the German offensive had caught the division mid-refit at Camp Mormelen in France, and the units had deployed to Bastogne with whatever they'd been carrying during a 72-hour road march. Some companies arrived with full ammo loads, others had fewer than 40 rounds per man. Polk's battalion had drawn from a depot that was itself drawing down stocks after the autumn offensives. They'd started the defense of Bastogne with approximately 11,000 rounds of .306 rifle ammunition, spread across 280 men, about 39 rounds per soldier. After 3 days of perimeter defense and localized counterattacks, that pool had shrunk to 67 rounds for 12 rifles. The other rifles in the company had been redistributed to units with ammo or set aside for parts. At 0515, Polk received a runner from battalion headquarters, a young corporal who'd navigated 400 meters of rubble-choked streets under intermittent mortar fire. The message was handwritten on the back of a German propaganda leaflet that had been airdropped the previous evening. It read, "All units consolidate ammo. Priority to perimeter positions. Expect ground attack dawn +2 hours. Air resupply uncertain. The 8th Corps aware." The phrase 8th Corps aware was military shorthand for "we've told someone with stars on their collar, and now we wait." Polk had been waiting for 3 days. He called his platoon leaders together in the bakery cellar. 3 lieutenants and a staff sergeant serving as acting platoon leader after Lieutenant Morrison caught shrapnel in the chest during a counterattack on the 15th. They spread a hand-drawn map on an overturned crate. The map showed Bastogne's perimeter as an irregular oval, roughly 6 kilometers across at its widest point. Red pencil marks indicated known or suspected German positions: Panzer Division elements to the west, 26th Volksgrenadier Division to the north, Fallschirmjäger units to the south. The encirclement was complete. No friendly forces held ground between Bastogne and the nearest Allied lines, which were somewhere beyond Neufchâteau, 12 kilometers southwest. Lieutenant Dalton, a former schoolteacher from Ohio, pointed to the northern arc of the perimeter. "I've got 8 rifles with ammunition, total of 41 rounds. We pulled back from the forward observation post at 0400 because we couldn't cover the approach with that. If they come from the north in company strength, we'll last about 6 minutes." His voice was flat, a statement of arithmetic rather than defeatism. Staff Sergeant Kowalski tapped the eastern sector. "We're at 17 rounds for 5 rifles. I moved everyone back to the secondary line and put the men without ammo on grenade duty. We've got 9 frags and 4 thermite grenades left. I also pulled the firing pins from 2 abandoned Springfields and told the men, if Germans get close enough, use them as clubs." Polk studied the map. The pattern was consistent across the battalion. Ammunition exhausted faster on the perimeter segments facing the most aggressive German probes, which created weak points that had to be reinforced by shifting men from quieter sectors, which in turn created new vulnerabilities. It was a shell game played with human lives and diminishing resources. Battalion had tried to even out the distribution by pulling ammo from reserve units and headquarters staff, but that well was now dry. The 67 rounds in Polk's company represented roughly 1/4 of the battalion's remaining rifle ammunition. The other companies were no better off. Machine gun ammunition was in slightly better shape, perhaps 2,000 rounds of .30 caliber remaining across the battalion's 12 M1919 Brownings. But machine guns were area weapons, useful for suppressing attacks across open ground. In close combat through Bastogne's streets and cellars, rifles mattered more. At 0545, the fog began to thin slightly. Visibility extended to perhaps 70 meters. Polk climbed to a second-story window in the bakery and glassed the northern approach with a pair of liberated German binoculars. The ground sloped gently downward from Bastogne toward the tree line 400 meters out. Snow covered everything, marked here and there by the black scars of shell craters and the dark lumps of abandoned equipment. Smoke from burning buildings 3 blocks west drifted across the scene, adding haze to the fog. He saw no movement, but that meant little. German infantry knew how to use terrain, and the trees offered concealment for battalion-sized formations. The radio in the cellar crackled. A transmission from Vouth Corps headquarters relayed through division. Polk descended and took the handset. The signal was weak, distorted by atmospheric interference and the marginal battery power. He caught fragments. Weather clearing, 1,000 hours possible. C-47 sorties authorized. Drop zones marked panels. Then the signal faded into static. The radioman adjusted the frequency and tried to re-establish contact, but got nothing. Polk handed back the handset. The message was clear enough. If the weather cleared by mid-morning, transport aircraft might attempt resupply drops. but mid-morning was 4.5 hours away, and forward observers were reporting engine noise that suggested a German attack might come sooner. The mechanics of air resupply over contested ground were complex and dangerous. C-47 transport aircraft, military variants of the Douglas DC-3 commercial airliner, could carry approximately 3 tons of cargo when configured for parachute drops. Each aircraft flew at altitudes between 150 and 300 meters to ensure accuracy, which put them well within range of German light anti-aircraft guns. Drop zones had to be marked with colored panels visible from the air, and ground teams had to recover the parachuted bundles before enemy forces could interdict them. A single C-47 sortie required coordination among airfield operations, weather forecasters, fighter escort schedulers, and ground units. In good weather, the system worked tolerably well. In the dense overcast and freezing fog that had blanketed the Ardennes since December 13th, it didn't work at all. Polk knew the numbers because he'd sat through a logistics briefing in October. A standard resupply bundle for rifle ammunition contained 500 rounds of .306 packed in bandoliers, wrapped in canvas, and dropped with a 24-foot parachute. Each bundle weighed approximately 42 pounds. A single C-47 could carry roughly 70 bundles, delivering 35,000 rounds per sortie. His battalion needed approximately 60,000 rounds to bring every rifle back to a sustainable combat load, call it 2 aircraft. But 2 aircraft had to reach Bastogne, identify the drop zone through smoke and haze, release their bundles accurately, and do so without being shot down by the ring of German flak guns surrounding the town. And even if the bundles landed inside the perimeter, they had to be retrieved and distributed under mortar fire. The window of time between aircraft overhead and ammunition in soldiers' hands was measured in hours, not minutes. At 0620, small arms fire erupted from the eastern perimeter, scattered rifle shots followed by the stutter of a machine gun. Polk grabbed his carbine and moved toward the sound with 4 men. They reached an intersection, 100 meters from the bakery, and found Lieutenant Hargrove crouched behind a stone wall, directing fire at targets. Polk couldn't see through the smoke. Hargrove pointed toward a cluster of shattered buildings. Patrol, maybe squad strength. They probed the outpost and pulled back when we engaged. His men were spacing their shots carefully, 1 round every 5 or 6 seconds. Ammunition discipline. Polk glassed the buildings but saw nothing. The firing tapered off and stopped. Hargrove's runner counted cartridges. The engagement had cost 11 rounds. No confirmed kills. No visible enemy casualties. It was the kind of contact that happened a dozen times per day. Small German units testing the perimeter, looking for weak spots, forcing the defenders to expend ammunition. Each probe cost the 101st resources it couldn't replace. Each probe gathered intelligence the Germans could use to plan a larger attack. By 0700, the fog had lifted enough that Polk could see 200 meters from the bakery's upper window. The sky remained overcast, a solid ceiling of grey at perhaps 500 meters. Not high enough for safe air operations, but better than the zero visibility soup of the previous 3 days. He watched the northern tree line and saw movement, figures in white winter camouflage moving laterally along the forest edge. He counted at least 30 before they disappeared into the trees. A platoon, maybe more, repositioning for an assault or simply shifting sectors. Either way, it confirmed what the engine noise had suggested. The Germans were preparing something. At 0745, a different sound reached the perimeter. A deep, rhythmic drone from the west. Aircraft engines. Polk stepped outside and scanned the overcast. The sound grew louder, resolved into multiple engines, heavy and unsynchronized. Then he saw them, 3 C-47 transports flying in loose trail formation, perhaps 200 meters above the cloud deck, heading east toward Bastogne. The lead aircraft dropped lower, descending through the overcast until it emerged at 300 meters. Polk could see the white star insignia on the fuselage. Behind him, soldiers began to cheer. The drop zone team had laid colored panels in a field 400 meters northwest of the town center, an open space perhaps 200 meters across, ringed by damaged buildings. Polk watched the lead C-47 line up on the panels and reduce speed. The cargo door was already open. At 0748, the first bundle tumbled out, followed by a rapid string of others, dark shapes against grey sky, parachutes blossoming white. Polk counted 30 bundles from the first aircraft before it banked away and climbed back into the overcast. The second C-47 approached on a similar line. More bundles cascaded out. The third aircraft followed. Then the German anti-aircraft guns opened fire. Orange tracers arced up from positions south of the town, 20 Flak from a battery that had been silent until this moment, probably waiting for exactly this opportunity. The tracers walked toward the third C-47. Polk saw strikes along the fuselage, bright flashes where rounds punched through aluminum skin. The aircraft shuddered, dropped its remaining bundles in a single salvo, and pulled hard to the right. Black smoke trailed from the port engine. The plane held altitude for perhaps 10 seconds, then began a shallow descent toward the west. Polk lost sight of it behind buildings. He didn't see it crash, but he heard the dull thump of impact a minute later. The drop zone team was already moving into the field, dragging bundles toward a collection point. German mortars began to bracket the area, ranging shots that threw up geysers of snow and frozen earth. Polk organized a recovery party and led them into the field. The bundles were scattered across a 100-meter radius. Some had landed cleanly. Parachutes draped over them like shrouds. Others had hit hard, bursting open to scatter bandoliers across the snow. One bundle hung from a skeletal tree, swaying in the wind. Polk directed his men to grab anything within reach and fall back to cover. They worked in pairs, one man dragging a bundle while the other covered. Mortar rounds continued to fall, close enough that Polk felt the concussion through his boots. A shell landed 15 meters away and threw shrapnel into the side of a building. A private named Keller took a fragment through the calf and went down. 2 men carried him back while a third grabbed the bundle Keller had been dragging. By 0810, they'd recovered 42 bundles from the drop zone. Polk estimated another 20 remained in the field, but German fire had intensified to the point where further recovery was suicidal. He ordered everyone back. They hauled the bundles into the bakery cellar and began breaking them open. Ammunition, medical supplies, rations, and unexpectedly several bundles of wool blankets and heavy socks. Polk's men tore open the ammunition bundles and began counting. 21 bundles contained rifle ammunition, approximately 10,500 rounds, enough to bring the battalion back to marginal combat effectiveness, at least for a few hours. Distribution took 30 minutes. Runners carried bandoliers to each perimeter position, prioritizing units that had been reduced to single-digit ammunition counts. Polk kept a reserve of 2,000 rounds at the bakery and sent the rest forward. By 0900, every rifleman in the company had at least 20 rounds. Not abundance, but enough to fight. At 0920, the German attack began. It came from the north and east simultaneously. Coordinated infantry assaults supported by mortar fire, and at least 2 self-propelled guns that Polk could hear but not see. The northern assault hit Lieutenant Dalton's platoon first. Polk listened to the volume of fire, and knew Dalton's men were burning through ammunition at an unsustainable rate. He sent a runner with another 100 rounds and orders to conserve fire. The eastern assault struck Staff Sergeant Kowalski's positions 10 minutes later. That engagement sounded lighter, more controlled, fewer shots. Kowalski was a veteran who understood fire discipline. Polk moved to a forward observation post and watched German infantry advance across open ground toward the northern perimeter. They moved in small groups, using craters and rubble for cover, laying down suppressive fire while other groups advanced. Professional tactics. He saw at least a company's worth of men, possibly more in reserve. The 101st positions fired in short bursts, conserving ammunition while forcing the attackers to stay in cover. A German machine gun opened up from a building 300 meters out, raking the American line. One of the battalion's .30 caliber Brownings answered, silencing it after a 15-round burst. The attack lasted 90 minutes. By 10:50, the German infantry had pulled back, leaving behind dark shapes sprawled in the snow. Polk counted 11 bodies visible from his position, but he knew there were more behind rubble and in dead ground. The 101st positions reported 9 casualties, 3 killed, 6 wounded. Ammunition expenditure: approximately 1,800 rounds of rifle ammunition, 300 rounds of machine gun ammunition. The resupply bundles had been partially depleted, but enough remained to sustain operations for another engagement or two. At 11:15, the overcast began to break. Patches of blue appeared between the clouds. By 11:30, the sky was half clear, and the temperature had risen to -8 Celsius. Polk heard aircraft again, this time from the south. He looked up and saw formations, dozens of C-47s flying at 500 meters in staggered V formations. Fighter escorts, P-7 Thunderbolts, circled overhead, keeping German interceptors at bay. The drop began at 11:42. Aircraft after aircraft lined up on the marked zones and released their bundles. Parachutes filled the sky, white, red, blue, yellow, color-coded by contents. Ammunition bundles were white, medical supplies red, rations blue. The bundles fell like snow, hundreds of them, blanketing the fields around Bastogne. German flak fired sporadically, but the volume of aircraft and the presence of fighter escorts limited its effectiveness. A few C-47 said took hits, but all remained airborne. Polk organized every available man for recovery operations. They moved into the drop zones and began hauling bundles back to collection points. The work was exhausting. Each bundle weighed between 40 and 60 pounds, and the snow was knee-deep in places. But the men moved with desperate energy, knowing this might be their only chance. By 1400, they'd recovered more than 200 bundles. By 1600, the count exceeded 400. Ammunition, food, medical supplies, winter clothing, and even mail from home. The logistics of the airlift were staggering. Someone in the 8th Corps headquarters had coordinated hundreds of sorties, thousands of tons of cargo, fighter escorts, drop zone marking, and weather forecasting to deliver this lifeline. Polk sat on a bundle of wool blankets and watched his men work. They were laughing now, some for the first time in days. One private found a bundle containing Christmas packages from the Red Cross, fruitcakes, candy, playing cards. Another discovered crates of .50 caliber ammunition for the M2 machine guns. Kowalski came by carrying a bundle over each shoulder. "We just got rich, Captain," he said. "Battalions up to full basic load, maybe more." At 17:30, as the winter sun set behind the overcast, Polk conducted an ammunition inventory. His company now held 23,000 rounds of rifle ammunition, enough for sustained operations for at least a week, assuming moderate expenditure rates. Machine gun ammunition had been replenished to more than 10,000 rounds. Mortar shells, grenades, medical supplies, all back to viable levels. The transformation from scarcity to sufficiency had taken less than 6 hours, powered by clear skies and the industrial capacity of the United States. But the reprieve was tactical, not strategic. The Germans still held the ring around Bastogne. The road to Neufchâteau remained blocked, and the weather forecast called for renewed overcast by morning, which meant the airlift window might close again. Polk knew the pattern would repeat: supply, combat, expenditure, resupply, the rhythm of siege warfare. The only question was whether the supplies would arrive faster than the defenders could consume them. At 1845, Division Headquarters sent a message via radio, Relief column departed Neufchâteau 1630, ETA Bastogne 2200 to 0200 depending on resistance. Maintain perimeter. Air resupply continues weather permitting. Well done. Polk read the message twice. A relief column meant armor and infantry strong enough to break through the German encirclement. It meant the siege might end tonight or tomorrow. It meant the 101st had held long enough. At 21:40, Polk heard gunfire from the south, heavier than the usual skirmishing, sustained and growing closer. Artillery joined in, the deep crump of American 105 mm guns firing counter-battery missions. The sound moved steadily northward. At 22:07, a column of Sherman tanks rolled into Bastogne from the southwest, followed by half-tracks carrying infantry from the 4th Armored Division. The lead tank stopped in the town square, and the crew dismounted. A captain with the shoulder patch of the 4th Armored shook hands with a major from the 101st. Polk didn't hear the conversation, but he saw the grins. The siege was broken. The encirclement had lasted 7 days. In that time, the 101st Airborne and attached units had repelled repeated German attacks with ammunition supplies that ranged from adequate to critically low. The air resupply operations on December 23rd and 24th had delivered more than 800 tons of supplies, ammunition, food, medical gear and equipment, dropped from C-47s flying through contested airspace into improvised drop zones. The tonnage represented the combined efforts of supply depots in England and France, air transport units flying round-trip missions of 8 hours or more, and ground crews who loaded bundles through the night. Polk later learned that the C-47 he'd seen smoking on December 23rd had crash-landed 4 kilometers west of Bastogne. The crew survived. The aircraft had been carrying ammunition bundles, 30 of which were salvaged from the wreckage by a recovery team and trucked into the perimeter the following day. Every round counted. The broader logistical picture revealed a system under strain but functioning. The European theatre of operations consumed approximately 700,000 tons of supplies per month during the winter of 1944 to 1945. Ammunition alone accounted for roughly 150,000 tons. The German offensive disrupted supply chains across the Ardennes, forcing emergency reallocations and priority shifts. Bastogne became a focal point because its road network was essential to both sides. The US decision to hold the town required committing limited air transport assets to a single besieged position, which meant reducing or delaying resupply to other units. The calculus was brutal. Save Bastogne and risk shortages elsewhere, or abandon Bastogne and concede the road network to the Germans. The air resupply effort involved more than 200 aircraft flying multiple sorties over 4 days. Losses were significant. 8 C-47s destroyed, 14 damaged severely enough to require depot-level repair, and 37 crew members killed or missing. But the operation succeeded in sustaining a division-sized force under siege long enough for ground relief to arrive. The ammunition delivered, approximately 300 tons, or roughly 6 million rounds of small arms ammunition, was consumed within 10 days of the breakout. Combat expenditure rates in high-intensity operations could exceed 50 rounds per rifleman per day, which translated to enormous logistical demands multiplied across an entire division. Polk's company spent another week in Bastogne before being rotated to a reserve position. In that week, they participated in limited counterattacks to expand the perimeter and engaged in daily firefights with German units still contesting the town's outskirts. Ammunition was no longer scarce. Supply trucks arrived daily once the roads were secured, but the combat was no less lethal. Polk lost 4 more men to enemy action and another 6 to cold injuries and illness. In January, after the bulge had been contained and the front lines stabilized, Polk attended a divisional briefing where the logistics officer presented a detailed breakdown of the Bastogne resupply operation. The numbers were staggering in their precision. Ammunition bundles dropped, rations delivered, medical supplies distributed, casualties treated, and enemy engagements repelled. The officer displayed charts showing expenditure rates versus resupply tonnage, cross-referenced with weather data and aircraft availability. It was warfare rendered as spreadsheet, a reminder that battles were fought with courage but sustained with calculations. One slide showed a graph. Ammunition availability over time for the 101st Airborne during the siege. The line dropped precipitously from December 16th through 22nd, bottoming out at critical levels on the morning of the 23rd. Then it spiked upward as the airlift delivered tonnage faster than combat could consume it. The graph line stabilized after December 24th and remained steady as ground convoys took over resupply duties. The visual was stark, a 7-day window where the defenders of Bastogne operated on dwindling resources, their combat effectiveness directly tied to whether aircraft could penetrate the weather and deliver bundles into contested drop zones. Polk thought about the 67 rounds he'd counted on the morning of December 16th. He thought about the C-47 he'd watched take flak hits while dropping its cargo. He thought about the soldiers who'd run into mortar fire to recover bundles from the drop zone. The entire sequence from scarcity to aerial resupply to renewed combat effectiveness had unfolded in less than 12 hours. The margin between holding and collapsing had been measured in tons of airdropped material and the willingness of transport crews to fly into ground fire. The final accounting of the Bastogne siege listed casualties, ammunition expenditure, and enemy losses. The 101st Airborne suffered approximately 2,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing during the encirclement. German casualties were estimated at 5,000, though exact figures remained uncertain. Ammunition expenditure for the 101st exceeded 1 million rounds of small arms ammunition during the 7-day siege, not including artillery shells and other ordnance. The resupply airlift delivered approximately 350 tons via parachute drop, supplemented by glider resupply missions that landed on improvised strips within the perimeter. The combined effort sustained a division through a week of continuous combat in sub-zero temperatures with limited ground access. Polk kept one souvenir from Bastogne, a single .30 Minier 06 cartridge, unfired, that he'd found in the bakery cellar after the siege ended. It had rolled into a corner and been overlooked during the distribution. He carried it in his pocket through the rest of the war, through the advance into Germany, the crossing of the Rhine, and the final push to the Elbe. The cartridge served as a reminder that wars were won not only through strategy and valor, but through the unglamorous arithmetic of logistics. Tons delivered, miles driven, sorties flown, bundles dropped. Each round of ammunition represented a supply chain stretching from a factory in the United States through depots, ports, airfields, and finally into the hands of a soldier standing on frozen ground in Belgium. Break any link in that chain, and the entire system faltered. After the war, historians analyzed the Bastogne operation in exhaustive detail. They studied German tactical decisions, Allied command responses, weather patterns, and logistical networks. The consensus emerged that the defense succeeded because resupply operations compensated for the garrison's inability to break the encirclement through combat alone. The airlift became the decisive factor, a reminder that modern warfare was as much about industrial output and transportation efficiency as it was about firepower and maneuver. The Germans had cut the roads, but they couldn't cut the sky, and that limitation cost them the battle. Polk eventually returned to civilian life, settling in Pennsylvania and working as a high school principal. He rarely spoke about Bastogne, but when he did, he emphasized the men who'd flown the C-47S and the ground crews who'd loaded the bundles. "We get credit for holding," he said in a 1983 interview, "but we held because someone made sure we had bullets. People forget that part." The interview was archived in the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress, one of thousands of oral histories documenting the war. Polk died in 1991, the cartridge from Bastogne still among his possessions. The lessons of Bastogne influenced US military logistics doctrine for decades. Air resupply became a core capability, integrated into planning for every major operation. Transport aircraft capacity expanded. Drop techniques improved. Coordination between air and ground units tightened. The industrial base adapted to produce not just weapons but the entire support infrastructure needed to sustain deployed forces. The feedback loop from combat experience to doctrinal change to industrial capacity characterized the American approach to logistics throughout the Cold War and beyond. Bastogne remains a case study in the relationship between supply and combat effectiveness. The siege demonstrated that even elite units could be rendered combat ineffective by ammunition shortages, and that restoring effectiveness required not just courage but functioning supply chains. The 67 rounds Polk counted on December 16th represented the nadir of that supply chain's performance. The 400 bundles recovered later that day represented its resilience. The difference between those two moments between desperation and sufficiency was the willingness of planners to commit resources, of pilots to fly into danger, and of soldiers to run into mortar fire to retrieve what the aircraft had delivered. The story of Bastogne is often told through the lens of combat. The encirclement, the German demands for surrender, McAuliffe's defiant response, the Christmas attack. But beneath that narrative runs a parallel story of logistics, equally dramatic and perhaps more consequential. Without the airlift, the 101st would have exhausted its ammunition by December 24th at the latest. Without ammunition, the perimeter would have collapsed. Without the perimeter, the Germans would have secured the road network. The strategic implications cascaded outward from that single logistical node. The men who flew the C-47 thus understood the stakes. Transport pilots were not combat pilots in the traditional sense. They flew unarmored aircraft designed to carry cargo, not to fight. But over Bastogne, they flew through flak, through small arms fire, through weather that would have grounded commercial aviation. They flew knowing that German fighters might intercept them, that mechanical failures at low altitude were often fatal, that a hit to the wrong system could turn a transport into a falling coffin. They flew because the men on the ground needed what they carried, and that need overrode the calculations of risk. The ground crews who loaded the bundles worked through similar mathematics. Each bundle had to be packed correctly, ammunition segregated by type, medical supplies cushioned against impact, rations waterproofed. Each bundle had to be rigged with a parachute that would deploy reliably at low altitude and high speed. Each bundle had to be positioned in the aircraft's cargo bay for sequential release. The margin for error was zero. A poorly packed bundle might rupture on landing, scattering its contents across a field where German mortars made recovery impossible. A poorly rigged parachute might fail, turning a ton of supplies into a crater. The ground crews knew this, and they worked with precision born of understanding consequences. The soldiers who recovered the bundles under fire performed the final link in the chain. They ran into open fields while German observers called artillery corrections. They dragged 40-pound bundles through snow, while machine guns raked the approaches. They worked until their hands froze or until enemy fire forced them back. And then they worked again. The recovery teams suffered casualties. Men hit by shell fragments, men caught by machine gun fire, men who collapsed from exhaustion and had to be carried back with the bundles. But they kept working because the alternative was watching their units run dry of ammunition and collapse under the next German assault. This network of effort, from factory to depot to airfield to aircraft, to drop zone to distribution point to foxhole, represented the industrial and organizational capacity that ultimately determined the outcome of the war. The Germans could match the Allies in tactical skill, in individual courage and operational planning, but they could not match the logistics. They could not produce the tonnage, fly the sorties, maintain the networks. By December 1944, the German war machine was consuming its reserves faster than it could replace them. The Allies, by contrast, were expanding their supply networks even as combat intensified. The contrast showed most clearly in ammunition. The Germans entered the Ardennes offensive with carefully hoarded stocks, knowing they had no strategic reserve. Every shell fired was a shell they couldn't replace. The US meanwhile produced ammunition at rates that exceeded expenditure even during the Bulge. When Bastogne needed 6 million rounds, the supply system delivered it within days. When other units needed replenishment, the system served them too. The bottleneck wasn't production, it was transportation. And even that bottleneck yielded to effort. Trucks drove through the night, aircraft flew through weather, crews worked through fatigue. Polk understood this in retrospect. At the time, in the bakery cellar on December 16th, he'd understood only that his company had 67 rounds and the Germans were preparing an attack. The broader context, the supply depots in Cherbourg, the aircraft warming up in England, the weather patterns shifting over the Atlantic, was invisible to him. He made decisions based on what he could see, the map, the ammunition count, the positions of his men. But those decisions were enabled by a system he couldn't see, a system that functioned because thousands of people performed unglamorous tasks with competence and commitment. The cartridge Polk carried through the rest of the war represented that system. It was a single round, mass-produced in a factory somewhere in the United States, shipped across the Atlantic, trucked through France, loaded onto an aircraft, dropped over Belgium, recovered under fire, distributed to a soldier, and by chance left unused. That single cartridge embodied a supply chain spanning thousands of kilometers and involving hundreds of people, and it was one of millions. The scale was almost incomprehensible, but the result was tangible. Soldiers who needed ammunition received it, and battles that might have been lost were won. The Germans, for their part, recognized the disparity. Captured documents and post-war interrogations revealed a consistent theme: surprise not at Allied tactics or courage, but at Allied abundance. German officers noted American units that fought until they ran low on ammunition, then received resupply and resumed fighting. They noted artillery barrages that seemed limitless, air support that arrived on call, logistics networks that repaired themselves faster than interdiction could disrupt them. The contrast with German scarcity was stark. By late 1944, German units were rationing ammunition, cannibalizing disabled vehicles for parts, and relying on captured supplies to sustain operations. The Ardennes offensive was mounted with the understanding that it had to succeed quickly, before the fuel and ammunition ran out. It didn't succeed, and they ran out. Bastogne became symbolic of that failure. The Germans surrounded the town, cut its roads, and waited for the garrison to collapse from lack of supplies. But the garrison didn't collapse. It adapted, conserved, improvised, and then when the weather cleared, it was resupplied from the air. The Germans had no equivalent capability. Their transport aircraft were few, their fuel scarce, their drop techniques less developed. They could interdict Allied supply lines, but they couldn't establish their own. That asymmetry decided the battle, and in a larger sense the war. The airlift over Bastogne was not the largest or most complex logistics operation of World War II. That distinction belonged to the support network sustaining the drive across France, the island-hopping campaign in the Pacific, or the strategic bombing offensive over Germany. But Bastogne was symbolic because it compressed the logistics challenge into a single visible crisis. For a few days in December 1944, the supply chain was laid bare, aircraft in the sky, bundles falling, men running through fire to collect them. The abstraction of logistics became concrete, and the importance of that system became undeniable. Polk's experience was replicated across thousands of units in dozens of battles. Every division, every regiment, every company depended on supply networks that functioned invisibly most of the time. When those networks worked, soldiers fought. When they didn't, soldiers ran out of ammunition and withdrew or surrendered. The difference between victory and defeat often came down to whether the supplies arrived on time, whether the trucks got through, whether the aircraft could drop their bundles in the right place. Combat heroism mattered, but so did organizational competence. The war was won by soldiers who fought, and by the people who ensured those soldiers had the tools to fight. The 67 rounds Polk counted on December 16th were not a failure of the system. They were evidence of a system under extreme stress that continued to function. The resupply that arrived hours later was evidence of a system that could recover, adapt, and deliver under conditions that should have made delivery impossible. The German failure to prevent that resupply was evidence of a disparity in capabilities that no amount of tactical skill could overcome. In the decades after the war, Polk occasionally spoke to school groups about his experience. He focused less on combat and more on logistics. He talked about counting ammunition, about watching aircraft drop bundles, about the private who took shrapnel recovering supplies. He wanted young people to understand that wars were not just about battles, they were about production lines, supply chains, transportation networks, and the people who made those systems work. "We held Bastogne," he would say, "because someone in a factory made bullets. Someone else packed them into bundles, someone flew them to us, and someone ran through mortar fire to bring them to us. That's how you win." The lesson resonated differently depending on the audience. Some students heard it as a story about teamwork. Others heard it as a story about logistics. A few heard it as a story about the industrial capacity that enabled the United States to fight a global war on multiple fronts while maintaining a civilian economy. All interpretations had merit. The story contained multitudes because the event itself was complex, a convergence of individual decisions, organizational systems, and strategic circumstances. Polk died in 1991. A few months after the Gulf War, he'd watched that conflict on television, noting the emphasis on logistics, the months of build-up, the supply lines stretching across Saudi Arabia, the precision of the transportation networks. He recognized the lineage. The US military had learned from Bastogne, from the Pacific campaigns, from every logistical challenge of World War II. The doctrine had evolved, the technology had improved, but the fundamental principle remained: supply your forces better than the enemy supplies theirs, and you create an advantage that tactics alone cannot overcome. The cartridge from Bastogne was buried with him, placed in his uniform pocket by his daughter. It seemed appropriate. The cartridge had been his companion through the war, and after, a tangible link to the moment when his company stood on the edge of collapse and the supply system pulled them back. That cartridge represented countless others, fired and unfired, that sustained the Allied war effort. It represented the people who made them, shipped them, delivered them, and used them. And it represented a principle that Polk had come to believe was essential, that logistics wasn't a support function, it was a combat multiplier, often the decisive one. Bastogne was relieved. The 101st held. The Germans failed to secure the road network. The Ardennes offensive stalled, and then reversed. By January, the Bulge was eliminated. By May, the war in Europe was over. Historians would debate the turning points: Normandy, Stalingrad, Midway, the Battle of the Bulge. But beneath every turning point lay a logistical foundation. Armies moved because fuel reached them. Soldiers fought because ammunition reached them. Wounded men lived because medical supplies reached them. The reach of those supply lines determined the reach of military power, and the US supply lines reached further than any in history. Polk's story was a single thread in that larger tapestry. He counted 67 rounds on a cold morning in Belgium. Hours later, he received thousands. The gap between those moments was bridged by a system that functioned despite every obstacle. That system didn't guarantee victory. Courage and skill still mattered, but it created the conditions for victory, and in the end, that was enough. The mechanics of the Bastogne airlift revealed themselves in layers of complexity. At the operational level, the 8th Corps Logistics Staff coordinated with Ein Troop Carrier Command to schedule sorties based on weather forecasts. Meteorologists studied atmospheric pressure patterns, cloud formations, and temperature gradients. On December 22nd, the forecast called for possible clearing on the 23rd. That forecast became the basis for launching more than 200 aircraft carrying 350 tons toward a besieged town surrounded by German anti-aircraft batteries. The aircraft, Douglas C-47 Skytrains, were workhorses of the Allied air transport fleet. Each could carry approximately 3 tons of cargo configured for parachute drops. They flew at altitudes between 150 and 300 meters to ensure accuracy, which put them well within range of German anti-aircraft guns. Drop zones had to be marked with colored panels visible from the air, and ground teams had to recover parachuted bundles before enemy forces could interdict them. Each bundle represented a logistical calculation. Ammunition bundles contained 500 rounds of rifle ammunition in bandoliers. Medical bundles contained plasma, morphine syrettes, sulfur powder, and bandages. Ration bundles held K rations and D rations. Each type was color-coded: white for ammunition, red for medical supplies, blue for rations. Bundles were packed to survive impact forces and rigged with 24-foot parachutes. Loading a C-47 required precision. Ground crews worked under time pressure, often at night under blackout conditions. Bundles had to be positioned in sequence for drop, with static lines properly routed. Each bundle was weighed to maintain aircraft center of gravity limits. A miscalculation could cause a stall at low altitude where recovery was impossible. The pilots who flew these missions came from diverse backgrounds. Some had flown commercial routes before the war, navigating by landmarks and radio beacons across familiar terrain. Others had trained exclusively for military operations, learning to fly in formation, navigate by dead reckoning, and operate in contested airspace. By December 1944, most C-47 pilots in the European theater had accumulated hundreds of hours flying supply missions, paradrop operations, and medical evacuations. They understood their aircraft's capabilities and limitations intimately. They knew that the C-47 was stable and forgiving in normal conditions but vulnerable when slow and low over hostile territory. The flight from bases in England and France to Bastogne took between 2 and 4 hours depending on departure point, weather, and routing. Aircraft flew in formations for mutual support and navigation efficiency, typically in Vs of 3 or trail formations of 5 to 9 planes. Fighter escorts, P-47 Thunderbolts equipped with drop tanks for extended range, accompanied the transports, providing top cover against German interceptors. The escort pilots faced their own challenges, maintaining position with slower transports while scanning for enemy aircraft, managing fuel consumption to ensure they could return to base, and suppressing flak batteries when possible. As the formations approached Bastogne, the tactical situation became critical. German flak batteries ringed the town, positioned to cover the most likely approach routes. The batteries included 20 mm automatic cannons with effective ranges up to 2,000 meters, 37 mm guns capable of reaching 3,000 meters, and heavier 88 mm guns that could engage targets at 5,000 meters or higher. The transport pilots had to descend to drop altitude between 150 and 300 meters, which put them squarely in the engagement envelope of every German gun within range. The decision to proceed despite this threat reflected a calculation. The garrison's need for supplies outweighed the risk to the aircraft and crews. The actual drop sequence lasted between 30 seconds and 2 minutes per aircraft, depending on payload. As the plane approached the drop zone, the crew chief opened the cargo door and prepared to kick out bundles on the pilot's signal. The pilot lined up on the colored panels marking the drop zone, reduced speed to approximately 120 miles per hour, and held altitude and heading steady despite any maneuvering that defensive instincts might have suggested. The crew chief pushed bundles out in rapid succession, each one tumbling briefly before its static line deployed the parachute. Proper spacing between bundles prevented mid-air collisions between parachutes and ensured the load dispersed across the drop zone rather than clustering in one area. From the ground, the sight was simultaneously spectacular and harrowing. Soldiers watched parachutes blossom against the grey sky, each canopy representing supplies they desperately needed. But they also watched tracer fire arc upward, saw aircraft take hits, heard the crump of exploding flak shells. The recovery teams moved out even before all bundles had landed, knowing that every minute of delay increased the likelihood of German artillery interdiction. The teams worked methodically despite the danger, grabbing the nearest bundles and dragging them to collection points behind cover. Recovery efficiency improved with practice. On the first day of the airlift, December 23rd, recovery teams managed to collect approximately 60% of dropped bundles before German fire forced them to withdraw. By December 24th, after refining their procedures, they recovered more than 80%. The improvement came from better organization, assigning specific teams to specific sectors of the drop zone, pre-positioning carts and sleds for hauling heavy bundles, establishing covered routes from the drop zone to distribution points. Small efficiencies compounded into significant gains. Distribution from collection points to forward positions involved its own challenges. Ammunition had to reach the units that needed it most urgently, but those units were often under fire and difficult to reach. Runners carried bandoliers through streets where snipers operated, and mortars fell randomly. Some runners made multiple trips, exhausting themselves in the process. Others were killed or wounded on their first attempt. The casualty rate among runners was disproportionately high. They were exposed and vulnerable, carrying loads that slowed them and made evasion difficult. Yet volunteers kept stepping forward because the alternative was watching their units run out of ammunition. The human cost of the airlift extended beyond the ground forces. Of the 200-plus C-47 sorties flown into Bastogne between December 23rd and 26th, 8 aircraft were destroyed, shot down by flak or crashed during emergency landings. 37 aircrew members died in those incidents. Another 14 aircraft sustained damage severe enough to require depot-level repair, essentially removing them from service for weeks or months. Dozens more aircraft returned with minor battle damage, holes in wings and fuselages, damaged control surfaces, shot-out windows. The crews patched what they could and flew again the next day. One incident illustrated the margins on which success balanced. On December 24th, a C-47 piloted by First Lieutenant Charles Moore took a direct hit from a 20 shell that severed hydraulic lines and damaged the port engine. Moore lost control of his ailerons and found his aircraft beginning a slow roll to the left. He compensated with rudder and throttle, maintaining enough control to stay airborne but unable to maneuver precisely. He still had 15 bundles aboard. He'd only completed half his drop when the flak hit. Against standard procedure, which called for aborting the mission and heading for friendly territory, Moore continued his approach and dropped the remaining bundles while fighting the controls. He then coaxed the damaged aircraft westward, losing altitude gradually, and crash-landed in a field 12 kilometers from Bastogne. The crew walked away. The 15 bundles Moore had dropped contained medical supplies that arrived at the 100 first aid stations within 2 hours, and were used to treat casualties from a German assault that afternoon. The medical dimension of the airlift was as critical as the ammunition resupply. By December 22nd, the 101st's medical staff had exhausted most of their plasma supply. Plasma, liquid blood with cells removed, was essential for treating shock and blood loss in wounded soldiers. Without it, survival rates for serious wounds dropped dramatically. The airlift delivered plasma in bundles packed with insulation and chemical heat packs to prevent freezing. Medics also received morphine syrettes for pain management, sulfur powder for infection prevention, and bandages to replace the increasingly threadbare materials they'd been reusing. The resupply transformed medical capabilities overnight. Surgeons who'd been rationing plasma could now treat wounds aggressively. Medics could administer adequate pain relief. Survival rates improved measurably. The rations delivered via airlift addressed a less dramatic but equally serious problem: caloric intake. Soldiers defending Bastogne were burning 4,000 to 5,000 calories per day due to cold exposure, physical exertion, and stress. Standard ration allocations provided approximately 3,000 calories per day when supplies were adequate. By December 22nd, many units were on half rations or less, consuming perhaps 1,500 calories daily. The resulting energy deficit degraded combat effectiveness. Soldiers became sluggish, less alert, more prone to errors. The rations dropped by airlift weren't gourmet meals, but they provided calories and essential nutrients. Within 24 hours of the resupply, unit commanders reported noticeable improvements in alertness and morale. The psychological impact of the airlift exceeded its material benefits. For 3 days, the defenders of Bastogne had watched their supplies dwindle with no relief in sight. The appearance of aircraft overhead, the sight of parachutes filling the sky, the tangible proof that someone outside the perimeter cared whether they lived or died, these factors boosted morale in ways that pure logistics calculations couldn't capture. Soldiers who'd been conserving their last few rounds suddenly had full magazines again. The mental shift from scarcity to adequacy changed how they approached combat. Defensive postures became more aggressive, patrols ranged farther, counterattacks became feasible again. The Germans recognized the shift. Intelligence reports captured after the siege revealed that German commanders viewed the airlift with a combination of frustration and respect. They understood that their encirclement strategy had failed not because of any tactical error, but because they couldn't prevent the Allies from using the third dimension. One captured German officer noted in his diary, "They supply their forces from the sky, while we scrape together fuel from depots 300 kilometers distant. This is not a war we can win." The observation was prescient. The Ardennes Offensive represented Germany's last major attempt to reverse the strategic situation in the West. Its failure ensured that the remainder of the war would be a fighting retreat toward Berlin. The broader implications of Bastogne resonated through military doctrine for decades. Air resupply became a standard capability, integrated into planning assumptions for every major operation. The U.S. military invested in specialized cargo aircraft with greater payload capacity, improved navigation systems, and better defensive measures. Drop techniques evolved. Low-altitude parachute extraction systems allowed aircraft to release cargo while maintaining airspeed and altitude, reducing vulnerability. Container design improved, with shock-absorbing materials and modular configurations that simplified loading and recovery. The feedback loop from Bastogne to institutional learning to capability development characterized the American military's approach to logistics throughout the Cold War. The siege also highlighted the importance of redundancy in supply chains. The Germans had cut Bastogne's road connections, assuming that would be sufficient to starve the garrison, but the Allies had multiple resupply options: air delivery via parachute, air delivery via glider, potential breakthrough by ground forces, and even experimental methods like cargo rockets that were tested but not deployed. Redundancy ensured that the failure of one method didn't collapse the entire system. This principle, build multiple pathways to the objective, became embedded in logistical planning. Another lesson involved the relationship between tactical and operational levels of war. The decision to hold Bastogne was tactical. It denied the Germans a critical road network. But sustaining that decision required operational-level support, allocating scarce transport aircraft, diverting fighter escorts, coordinating weather forecasting, managing depot stocks to ensure sufficient supplies existed to deliver. The success at Bastogne depended on synchronization between levels of command that often operated with different priorities and timelines. That synchronization didn't happen automatically. It required staff officers who understood both the tactical situation and the operational constraints, who could translate battlefield needs into logistical requirements and vice versa. The airlift also demonstrated the value of preparation. The Allies had developed air resupply doctrine and procedures through years of experience in North Africa, Italy, and France. They'd refined parachute designs, bundle configurations, and drop techniques through trial and error. By December 1944, the system wasn't perfect, but it was mature. The crews knew their jobs, the equipment mostly worked, The organizational structures existed to coordinate complex operations under pressure. That institutional knowledge, accumulated through experience and transmitted through training, was as important as the physical infrastructure. Individual stories from the airlift illustrated the human dimension of these systemic factors. Technical Sergeant Michael Riley, a crew chief on a C-47, flew 7 consecutive sorties into Bastogne between December 23rd and 25th. On his 4th sortie, his aircraft took flak damage that punctured the fuselage and injured the co-pilot. Riley administered first aid while continuing to manage bundle drops. On his 6th sortie, one of his parachutes failed to deploy properly, and he watched the bundle tumble to earth and burst open, scattering rations across the snow. He blamed himself for the failure, though investigation later revealed a manufacturing defect in the parachute rigging. On his 7th sortie, he delivered the final bundles to reach Bastogne before the ground relief column broke through. Riley survived the war and later worked as a commercial airline mechanic. He rarely discussed his war service, but he kept a photograph of a C-47 in his toolbox for 40 years. Private First Class Elena Vasquez, a supply clerk at a depot in Cherbourg, worked 20-hour shifts during the Bastogne crisis, assembling bundles and loading them onto trucks bound for airfields. She packed ammunition bandoliers with meticulous care, knowing that sloppy packing could result in rounds breaking loose and rattling around inside a bundle, potentially causing misfires or jams when they reached the end users. She packed medical supplies with equal attention, ensuring that fragile glass vials were cushioned and that inventory lists matched actual contents. In 3 days, she handled more than 300 bundles. After the war, she returned to California and became a logistics manager for a shipping company. She attributed her career success to lessons learned during those 3 intense days in Cherbourg. Captain Thomas Briggs, a fighter pilot flying P-47 escort for the transport missions, engaged German fighters on 2 occasions over Bastogne. In the first engagement, he shot down a Focke-Wulf Full 190 that was positioning for an attack on a C-47 formation. In the second, he drove off 3 Messerschmitt Bf 109s through aggressive maneuvering, sustaining minor damage to his own aircraft, but preventing the Germans from closing on the transports. Briggs later reflected that his primary mission wasn't to score kills, it was to keep the transports safe. Every C-47 that got through meant American soldiers got supplies, he said in a post-war interview. Every one I failed to protect meant soldiers went without. The math was simple. These individual contributions, multiplied across thousands of participants, constituted the system that sustained Bastogne. The system wasn't monolithic or impersonal. It was composed of people making decisions, performing tasks, taking risks. Some decisions were brilliant, others were adequate. A few were errors that had to be overcome or absorbed. But the aggregate result was a functioning supply chain that delivered what was needed when it was needed. The relief column that broke through to Bastogne on December 26th was itself a logistical achievement. The 4th Armored Division had driven more than 100 kilometers in 48 hours, fighting through German defensive positions while maintaining enough fuel and ammunition to sustain combat operations. Their supply trains followed closely, bringing forward the material needed to continue the advance. The link-up between the 4th Armored and the 101st Airborne wasn't just a tactical victory, it was a demonstration that mobile warfare required logistics that could move as fast as the combat units. After the link-up, supply convoys began flowing into Bastogne over the reopened roads. The airlift tapered off as ground transportation took over the primary resupply mission. But the transition wasn't instant. Aircraft continued to deliver supplies for another 2 days, supplementing the ground convoys until the road network was fully secured. The redundancy proved valuable when German artillery interdicted one convoy route, forcing a temporary rerouting. Aircraft filled the gap until alternate routes were established. The final tally of the Bastogne airlift was impressive by any standard. Between December 23rd and 28th, Allied aircraft delivered approximately 962 tons of supplies to the besieged garrison. Of that total, approximately 350 tons arrived via parachute drop during the critical period when the encirclement was complete. The remainder came via glider deliveries and aerial resupply after the ground corridor was partially opened. The supplies sustained 23,000 soldiers, the 101st Airborne elements of the 10th Armored Division, and various attached units through 7 days of continuous combat in sub-zero temperatures against an enemy that outnumbered them and held nearly every tactical advantage except supply access. The cost was significant but sustainable. 8 C-47 CES destroyed, 14 badly damaged, 37 aircrew killed, and an unknown number wounded. Additional costs included wear and tear on aircraft and crews, fuel consumption, and the opportunity cost of diverting resources from other theatres. But the return on investment was clear. Bastogne held, the German offensive stalled, and the Allies retained the initiative. The campaign in northwestern Europe continued on schedule, leading ultimately to the crossing of the Rhine and the advance into Germany. Polk carried his memories of Bastogne for the rest of his life. In quiet moments, he thought about the soldiers who'd counted bullets, the pilots who'd flown through flak, the medics who'd reused bandages, and all the others who'd contributed to the defense. He understood that his experience was particular but not unique. Thousands of soldiers in dozens of battles had faced similar situations. The specifics varied, different terrain, different weapons, different enemies, but the fundamentals remained constant. Supply your forces. Deny supply to the enemy. Win the logistics war and you create the conditions to win the shooting war. That understanding shaped how Polk taught history after he returned to civilian life. He emphasized to his students that wars were won not just by generals and soldiers, but by factories and supply clerks, by transport pilots and truck drivers, by all the people who ensured that the right material reached the right place at the right time. He wanted them to understand that logistics wasn't boring, it was the foundation on which everything else rested. And he wanted them to appreciate that every person in that chain, from the worker who packed a bullet at an ammunition plant in Illinois to the soldier who fired it in Belgium, was essential. The cartridge Polk kept was a physical reminder of those connections. It was one bullet among millions, unremarkable in itself, but representative of the entire system. Holding it, Polk could trace the chain backward. The brass casing formed from copper and zinc mined in the United States, refined and pressed into shape. The gunpowder manufactured from nitrocellulose derived from cotton. The lead bullet cast and jacketed. The primer compound, a sensitive explosive that would ignite the powder, carefully measured and inserted. The complete cartridge inspected, boxed, shipped, warehoused, loaded onto a transport, flown to Europe, dropped over Bastogne, recovered, distributed, and finally overlooked in a corner of a cellar. That chain represented thousands of hours of labor, coordination of hundreds of organizations, and the industrial output of a nation mobilized for war. And it represented something more. The principle that abundance properly applied was a weapon as effective as any tank or bomber. The Germans in late 1944 had courage, tactical skill, and experienced soldiers, but they didn't have abundance. They rationed fuel, conserved ammunition, made do with worn equipment. The Allies, by contrast, could afford to be wasteful, not in the sense of careless expenditure, but in the sense of overwhelming application. If a position needed suppression, they could fire 10,000 rounds to ensure it. If an attack needed support, they could call in artillery and airstrikes without worrying about depleting strategic reserves. That freedom of action came from logistics, and logistics came from industrial capacity and organizational competence. Bastogne was a case study in that principle. The defenders started the siege with inadequate supplies. The attackers controlled the ground and could, theoretically, wait them out. But the Allies had air superiority and the capacity to deliver supplies from the sky. That one advantage reversed the dynamic. The besiegers became the ones under pressure, because every day the garrison held was another day for Allied reinforcements to arrive. The encirclement that should have been an asset became a liability. By December 26th, when the relief column broke through, the German forces around Bastogne were exhausted and low on supplies themselves. The hunters had become the hunted. Polk understood this in hindsight, though at the time he'd been focused on immediate concerns, keeping his soldiers alive, managing resources, responding to threats. The strategic picture was invisible from a cellar in Bastogne, but after the war, after studying the campaign, after teaching about it for decades, he saw how the pieces fit together. The 67 rounds he'd counted weren't an isolated data point. They were evidence of a supply chain stretched to its limit, but not broken. And the thousands of rounds delivered hours later weren't luck. They were the result of decisions made by people he'd never met, flying aircraft he'd never seen, supported by organizations he'd barely understood, all of it synchronized to solve the problem he faced. The Bastogne experience influenced more than military doctrine. It shaped cultural memory and national identity. The siege became symbolic of American resilience. The story was retold with emphasis on the paratroopers' courage, McAuliffe's defiant response, and the relief column's drive through enemy lines. But underlying all narratives was the logistical accomplishment. The garrison held because it was supplied through a complex system functioning under extreme pressure. Veterans of Bastogne carried diverse memories. Some remembered the cold most vividly, numb fingers, ice on rifle actions, huddling for warmth. Others remembered hunger and fear, the constant awareness that death could arrive through a mortar shell or sniper round. Nearly all remembered the relief when aircraft appeared overhead and parachutes blossomed. That moment, the transition from isolation to connection, from scarcity to sufficiency, became a defining memory for an entire generation. The civilian workers who supported the airlift had their own memories. Factory workers remembered production urgency. Depot clerks remembered packing accuracy pressure. Air crew remembered tracer fire and damaged aircraft limping home. Meteorologists remembered weather forecasting responsibility. Each person carried a piece of the story, forming a mosaic of the entire operation. Historians debated Bastogne's significance. Some argued it was merely a delaying action. Others contended its fall would have opened routes westward and prolonged the war. The debate missed a larger point. Bastogne demonstrated what Allied logistics could accomplish. It proved that encirclement wasn't necessarily decisive if forces could be sustained from the air. Those lessons transcended any single battle. The legacy extended into peacetime. The Berlin airlift of 1948 to 1949, sustaining 2 million Berliners through Soviet blockade, drew directly on Bastogne lessons. The tonnage delivered to Berlin dwarfed the Bastogne operation more than 2 million tons over 11 months. But principles were identical: use air power to overcome ground obstacles, organize efficient delivery systems, maintain operations despite weather and hostile action. Similarly, U.S. military interventions in Korea, Vietnam, and later conflicts relied on air logistics as core capability. The ability to establish supply lines independent of ground transportation became strategic advantage. The C-47 that flew over Bastogne were succeeded by C-119S, C-130S, C-141S, and C-17S, each generation more capable. But the mission remained fundamentally the same: deliver supplies when needed, despite obstacles. Polk's teaching career spanned 3 decades. He showed students maps, photographs, documents. He played veteran oral histories. His most effective teaching tool was the cartridge. He would hold it up during lectures and ask students to imagine the chain of effort it represented. The cartridge became a physical connection to events that had happened decades earlier, in a place most students would never visit. Near the end of his life, Polk was interviewed for a Battle of the Bulge documentary. Asked about his most vivid memory from Bastogne, he described December 23rd when first aircraft appeared. "I remember standing in the street, watching parachutes fill the sky, and thinking, someone cared enough to send this. Someone in a factory made bullets. Someone loaded the plane. Someone flew through Flak to deliver it. All those people doing their jobs so we could do ours. That's what I remember most. The documentary included that quote, along with footage of Bastogne as it appeared decades later, a peaceful Belgian town with memorials and preserved fortifications, marking where desperate battles had been fought. The contrast illustrated what had been at stake. The soldiers defending Bastogne fought to protect towns like the one they occupied, to ensure future generations could live in peace. Polk died in 1991, shortly after the Gulf War concluded. That conflict, fought with overwhelming technological superiority and meticulous logistical preparation, represented the culmination of lessons learned over 5 decades of modern warfare. The coalition that liberated Kuwait deployed more than 500,000 troops, sustained by supply networks delivering thousands of tons daily. His funeral was attended by former students, fellow veterans, and family. The cartridge from Bastogne was buried with him, placed in his uniform pocket as requested. It seemed fitting for an object that had accompanied him through so much of his life. The cartridge had been manufactured during the war, delivered to Bastogne's overlooked in distribution, recovered after the siege, carried through the European campaign, brought home and kept for 46 years, as a reminder of what logistics meant and why it mattered. In death as in life, the cartridge remained connected to Polk's identity and his understanding of how wars were won. It represented a principle he taught throughout his career, that victory required not just battlefield courage, but the unglamorous competence of supply systems functioning under pressure, delivering what was needed when it was needed, creating the foundation upon which all military success ultimately rested.